So it seems that the Warhammer 40k points updates have brought some enormous buffs for the greenskins. Let's talk about what's happened for the Orks, and which of their units are looking best now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orks and the Balance update, with a good look through all their points and rules changes, and how it's going to impact the greenskins on the tabletop. Since the prior Nexus update, Orks have been waiting for something like this to give them a much needed shot in the arm. When their codex came out, they were initially very strong, in particular detachments like Green Tide with 120 boys swarming the entire table, and Bully Boys with massive amounts of unkillable Meganobz tended to be the ways to go. And then when Games Workshop updated the game last time around, some fairly heavy-handed nerfs basically pushed them all the way back to the bottom tier of power in Warhammer 40k. Not completely unusable, and a few people had some notable success with them at higher levels, but despite being a really popular faction, no one managed to take down a grand tournament with them this entire time, even if lots of people came close, and that's just not something that tends to happen with an army doing well, even if lots of people got very close. In more recent times, it's mainly been Warhorde as the primary detachment that people tend to do well with, and then interestingly Dreadmob is the next most played after that, and plenty of people will still try out the others and trying to make them work. I do feel like detachments such as the Big Hunt and Cult of Speed could probably use rules updates as opposed to points changes to help them out, but I guess we'll see if anything happens to that extent when Games Workshop brings out their balanced data slate in December. This update though gave them a whole bunch of points reductions from the Minotaur and Field Manual, plus a few nice changes within the FAQs, including one particularly good one for the Warboss. For this video I thought we'd take a look through what's changed and how impactful those changes might be. First up, let's start with the Warboss change, which is probably low-key one of the most important changes out of the whole set of them. The Ork Warboss is a very cheap and efficient 65-point datasheet that can punch nicely hard with his Power Claw, plus gives you a +1 to hit with a big mob of boys or knobs, and is just generally very strong. His special rule is that he gets +4 attacks in the round of the war, basically meaning that he gets 9 attacks there, which is pretty massive, all at boosted strength, and should genuinely account for a bunch of damage on a big vehicle or something, or maybe a bunch of Space Marines slain. Due to technical reasons though, he wouldn't get that buff if he was embarked on a transport when you called the war, as it keyed off when you called the war, and models and transports aren't counted as being on the board at that point, and Games Workshop doubled down on that take with an FAQ last time around. It was quite a big nerf to an important datasheet, as jumping out of trucks and wagons tends to be the best way to get greenskin violence into melee. That was definitely a big talking point after they did it. Pretty much everyone thought that it was a pretty dumb ruling, so it really is quite nice to see that they've basically changed the wording of it via some errata. Their chosen fix was to amend the wording of the rule and or similar abilities as well to work when a war is active for your army as opposed to when the war is called. In the same FAQ as well, they also stated that this would work for the second turn in the Bully Boys detachment, so you would get the +4 attacks for the 2 different turns, and again it would still work if you were embarked in a transport when it was called at the start of the turn. Overall, it's pretty cool to help the Orks take down some of the tougher targets around. Genuinely quite a big buff to the Warboss, who's a staple datasheet at 65 points. Otherwise, 2 of the bigger winners that were basically good datasheets that got better were the Boys and the Beast Snagger Boys. The regular Boys datasheet dropped from 85 points per 10 models down to 80 points, so a 6% decrease there. Even small reductions on Boys can add up to quite a lot if you're spamming a lot of the datasheet over the army. They're fairly commonly used in a lot of lists, jumping out of transports, doing sticky objective type things, and just having genuinely quite scary damage output against anything Space Marine size and smaller. They'll also be one of the units that most enjoys pairing with the Warboss as well, with trucks to get them into the fight. This one's going to be really quite a good direct buff to Green Tide as well though. If you were going for Boys Before Toys, that's 120 boys for 960 points, so you haven't even spent 1,000 points of the army list by the time that you've put that many in an army. For an 120 boys list, that's around about 60 points saved, which put with something else could be enough to allow another leader character or something. Beast Snagger Boys got an even more generous cut though. They went down from 105 to 95, so a big 10% drop there. They're basically boys that get a 6+ Feel No Pain, Strength 5 and some rerolls against tough stuff. And again, they were a datasheet that was already really quite commonly played, maybe most commonly paired with an on-foot beast boss for some devastating wounds against the toughest things around, as really quite a general purpose damage dealer squad. Looks like given the points decreases, they might gain a little bit on the regular ones in this update, though not crazily so. And they're certainly going to be enjoying the change to kill rigs as well, which seemed like a better way to get there than ever. Before we move on, I thought I'd just give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, and that's Only Games Crates. They're a 3D printing on-demand company based in the UK that have all sorts of print-on-demand miniatures up for sale. Feel free to check them out, linked in the video description. There's lots and lots of designs there, and more being added all the time. For this one, they asked to sponsor some Orc related content for their crates offering, which is basically a fun monthly miniature promo type thing. A subscription service where they send you out a bunch of miniatures each month, the sub costing £10 or $13 plus postage and packaging, and each month they send you a little box that has 3 printed miniatures in them. The idea is the entertainment of a painting project, with a bit of fun factor in not knowing exactly which miniatures turn up each month. If anyone's sobbing for the month of October, it's this trio of Orcs with rocket launchers. If you wanted specifically these miniatures though, they did give me perhaps a surprisingly generous discount code, the Auspex crate one that you can see on screen, and that gets you a 1 month free trial of the service, so all you have to pay is postage. So essentially it's 3 Orcs posted to your door for £6 in the UK, $9 in the USA, or around about €8 in the EU, which really isn't too bad on a per miniature basis. Then after that, if you stay signed up with them, it's £10, €12 or $13 per month, plus the above postage. You don't have to stay signed up if you don't want to. They do have an Orky Fantasy offering as well, made by a different creator. This one's by Artisans Guild, and that's a separate subscription they have running alongside. And here's just a few examples of the sci-fi ones that they've had in the past. They seem to go with a bit of a theme of the month each time. In any case, feel free to check them out in the video description if you want a few cheap Orky miniatures with some rockets, and of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. Getting back to the big Orky buffs though, next up we have Meganobz. They were perhaps one of the culprits to the Orcs' downfall, flying too close to the sun with their very cheap points costs and massive feel no pains. It was clear that Games Workshop had overcorrected them to 40 points, though even despite this they were still being used as a 2 Orc bodyguard for Ghazghkull, even if that was just primarily to trigger his massive damage buffs that he gets when he's leading a unit. It is nice to see them drop down to 35 from 40 though. That feels a fair bit more in line with their abilities. They were just a flat overcosted unit before, though I feel like it's probably still a little bit borderline as to whether or not they're outright strong for the Orcs yet, or merely getting a lot more usable. I feel like we'll probably get at least some people experimenting with them again as a more mainline damage and defense type unit. It still seems like Bully Boys would probably be the best place for them, 2 turns of that rather nice feel no pain, even if it's a 5+, not a 4+ anymore. And they're strong in plenty of the other detachments when they need to be. Warhorde may be one of the better ones, giving them sustained hits and helping out with that low volume of attacks. For other Orc mobs that went down, the Kommandos got a drop from 135 to 120, an 11% points decrease there, which is a fairly substantial one. Kommandos were a unit that was used occasionally in competitive, though the majority of top lists tended to leave them at home. They felt more like a unit that you'd take just literally for the infiltration rule and more sort of big game plays. Just having some scary melee Orcs to threaten the midfield right from turn 1, it was quite a big deal. Just helping with the entire Orky melee rush pressure type thing that they have going on, and potentially keeping the opponent hemmed in their deployment zone for a bunch of turns if they want to stay safe. At 135 points though, it did feel like a bit of a tax. I feel like 120 is far more reasonable. They're basically 40 points more than a unit of Boyz now, which doesn't seem too bad for the privilege. Just nice to be able to hide out of line of sight on midfield objectives, or potentially threaten turn 1 charges if the enemy's got soft targets that aren't going to want to get hit very hard with a chopper. The other mob that went down a fair bit were Tankbustas, who got one of the biggest relative points decreases, going down 18% to 90 points. Unfortunately though, despite that big buff, they were really very overcosted before, so I don't think it's going to be enough to turn them around just yet. Jumping out of a truck or battle wagon and things, if they can guarantee basically shooting and then charging a medium vehicle like a Predator tank, they genuinely don't have too awful damage output, maybe dealing something along the lines of 7 or 8 wounds-ish on average. But if you're doing that, then you do have to get them there, and if they ever get shot at all or overwatched or anything like that, they're just ridiculously fragile for how much they cost. 18 points for a standard Boy stat line just really isn't that good. To be honest, the points cost probably isn't incredibly relevant for them. No one's really been using them up to now, and seems likely that not too many people will be using them until they get their new datasheet with their kill team kit, which looks like it's going to be quite different based on the models and their equipment. I somehow have a sneaky suspicion that Games Workshop will probably find a way to make their rules good as soon as they've got some nice shiny new plastic to sell us. Perhaps one of the single biggest Orky winners of the points update though is the kill rig. This thing was already usable enough at 170 points, and it went down a good solid 15 points to 155. I think that takes it from just a unit I'd rate as solid to one that's outright very strong. Whenever I talk about kill rigs, it just takes a long time to list all the things they do. They're nice and tough at 16 wounds at toughness 10 with a 6+ feel no pain. That's really good for 155 points. They've got D3 auto-hitting las cannon style shots with that whir tower, plus a tiny bit more threat with that heavy lobber and sticker cannon if they do manage to hit anything with it. You can transport 10 beast snagger boys and a boss, so a nice scary unit with a lot of objective control to jump out of it and can get them into the battle. It's OC5 itself, which isn't awful for objectives. It's got a 10-inch move with the potential for advance and charge in the war when it needs it, a buff that gives you +1 strength to a unit within 12 inches that activates in the fight phase, and then some OK melee of its own right between swords, butcher boys and horns. The 3 profiles should at least cause a bit of damage on virtually whatever it charges, even if it's probably a bit stronger against infantry than heavy tanks. I feel like it's one of the most relevant points updates alongside the Boyz ones, as it takes a unit that was already strong and makes it significantly more so. The Hunter rig also dropped down to 135 points. That's now incredibly tough for the cost as well. It just seems that if you're only taking 3 or less of them, you'd usually want to upgrade to the kill rig for the 20 points. D3 auto-hitting las cannon style shots just isn't something that you want to pass up with Orks given their limited anti-tank. Plus the ability to maybe do it all over again in Overwatch is all very nice. Torrent anti-tank isn't the sort of thing that most factions have the luxury of accessing. Next up, there's some help to Dread Mob with a trio of walkers going down a bit. The Def Dread dropped down to 120 points from 130, so an 8% cut there. That'll certainly put it in the right direction, though I'd still say it's a little bit on the pricey side at 120 for what it really does. In the Dread Mob list that have done well since the balanced data slate, I've seen very few bothering to use Def Dreads, and I feel like it probably should have been a little bit cheaper than 120. It's definitely less bad than it was before though. Potentially can be fairly shooty with lots of custom Mega Blasters, or fairly fighty with some melee. Otherwise, the Naughts both dropped down 15 points, the Gorkanaut 265 and the Morkanaut 280. These get you really quite a lot of stats for the cost, 20 wounds at toughness 12 with a 3+ save. The melee is kind of similar to that on Imperial Knights, the Gorkanaut getting +1 to hit in the war. It also gets a bunch of inaccurate firepower, where the Morkanaut's more focused on sort of anti-tank and anti-elite shooting with its custom mega things. In general, when they get played, it tends to be in Dread Mob, where they are pretty reasonable as a good target for some of the very powerful stratagems of that detachment. Some lists that have done well have included one of them. I've seen the Gorkanaut a bit more commonly in attendance than the Morkanaut. Next up, the Deffkoptas are down from 100 points to 90. Like the Def Dreads, they were previously at least fairly niche. I didn't see many of them used at all in stronger lists. Compared with some orky stuff, they really weren't unusable, with a bit of damage 3 rocket fire, and then a whole bunch of volume melee with those spinning blades, though I think that this points cut was really quite reasonable and a good step in the right direction. In terms of synergies, they tended to get on best with Cult of Speed, though that detachment just isn't really overall strong, and I kind of wonder if Games Workshop's planning to do something with it in the December balance update. It was kind of notable that the October buggies really didn't get anything, despite being clearly some of the most overcosted units in the Ork Codex right now. I'm really hoping that this is because Games Workshop's going to give them some sort of rules boost as opposed to a points decrease. I think that's really the only way to make them feel good on the tabletop. They're just really quite massive clunky things, so it doesn't really make sense for them to be something like 50 points or something. I think people would far rather them be a lot more dangerous on the tabletop than even more dirt cheap in points. I think I'd probably rather see individual buffs to their actual datasheet stat lines as opposed to just making the Cult of Speed better, as that'll make them just even more shoehorned into that one detachment, but either will be better than how they are now. Then finally for the points changes, we've got the Big Meks. The regular Big Mek dropped down from 80 points to 70. He's a bit of an odd mixed role datasheet with the boosted advance thing with his teleporter. A bit of shooting, a bit of melee, and reroll ones to hit at range. It really does feel a little bit unclear as to exactly what he's aimed to do in the Ork Codex, other than maybe just giving the mech keywords to knobs or boys in Dread Mob. I still can't imagine him being particularly stand out at 70 points. The shock attack gun Big Mek is 65 points down from 75. He feels like the one to go for if you're leading looters in Dread Mob. They really are quite a competitive staple in that detachment. Not uncommon to see 3 units of 10 looters with shock attack gun mechs attached, and then make some good use of the damage dealing that they can do. They're already a cheap and shooty firebase, now they're going to get even more so. And then the Big Mek in Mega Armor's down to 90 points. Maybe that might help him be a bit more balanced versus the Mega Boss. He's the one that gets up slaying Meganobz and can patch other ones back together. Though it's just really dependent on them being a strong enough datasheet to be worth that kind of attention and not be getting more from a big boss with a huge chopper. Out of these, the shock attack gun drop feels like the most relevant one, particularly for looters in Dread Mob. Overall though, putting the changes together, it does feel like it's a really solid general purpose improvement for the Orks. Most of the units either went from bad to usable or usable to genuinely quite good, and it feels like multiple different lists worth of detachments will get stronger as a result. The Boyz and the Warboss buff I think feel like some of the most impactful out of any of them. They were often being used in a whole bunch of army lists regardless of what else was going on, and I feel like kill rigs at 155 points probably join them in that kind of category now. Just seems to be hard to go too far wrong with throwing one or two in virtually any army now. No doubt with some beast snagger boys and a beast boss on the inside if you want to. Otherwise, dread mobs definitely got help. The shock attack guns being nicer is good, as are the Gorkanauts and the Death Dreads. Green Tide feels like it was very directly helped by this one. Just 5 points off Boyz is enough to make a meaningful difference for that. As said, putting 120 Boyz on the table for under 1,000 points is pretty big for most Ork armies, regardless of what the rest of the list does. Meganobz getting cheaper might make Bully Boys more relevant again. I'm still not sure if they're quite where they need to be yet, though I guess we'll see if anyone makes them work. Overall though, I feel like it should be a bit of a relief for Ork players, hopefully being a bit more mid-tier or at least lower mid-tier now, both of which would be an improvement on where they are now. And I guess for wish listing for the December balance data slate, something to help out Cult of Speed or Da Big Hunt rules wise, that should be pretty nice to go alongside. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on the Orks update though. How good do you think it is overall, and how will it change your list that you put on the table, if at all? As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to Only Games Crates for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out the links down in the video description for a trio of unusually cheap Orks with rocket launchers. As I mentioned, if you use that code Auspex Crates, then you get the first month free, and you only need to pay P&P, which could make these guys a good deal for this month at least. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly be back for a few more videos on the balance update in the next 24 hours or so feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see more. As always, if you'd like to support the channel, feel free to check out the Patreon page in the video description. Patrons do get a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry to the monthly prize giveaways. There's also plenty more bits down in the video description. Feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers if you're picking up any more orky things for a bit of money off versus the Warhammer web store. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.